Welcome to Civil Society 2, Hungarian Boogaloo, where I keep my face on screen because I did well with the metrics. I attribute the success to my good looks since it has smitten both women and deep web internet trolls. Once upon 2 months ago, I talked about civil society and the philosophical evolution of that concept. I then promised that my next video was going to be about civil society in communist Hungary. Much like my parents, you were disappointed. But have no fear, a slightly larger subscriber base, as I make good on my promise of delivering high-quality historical content as we delve into why the civil society system in Hungary caused a non-violent and gradual transition from communist dictatorship to a democracy. Quick note, if you have no idea what a civil society is, I'm going to have to ask you to watch my previous video. It's not up to the standard that I have in my videos today, mainly my face isn't in it, and we all know you love that. But it's going to help you understand what I'm talking about. Hungary, a small landlocked country in Central Europe, is definitely a weird one when it comes to that region. Its language does not relate to its neighbors, and its people and culture originates on the eastern side of the Ural Mountains. The Magyars, the name Hungarians give to themselves, immigrated to Europe during the 9th and 10th century AD. Now, this immigration process didn't exactly look like how my great-grandfather immigrated to Manhattan. Instead of a wool hat, a coat, and a work ethic, they had helmets and armor, and spears the size of a horse. They caused so much destruction pillaging west that the local people thought they were the Hun, returning to scourge Europe for some unchristianly sin, hence the name Hungarian. When they were done gallivanting around Europe like a posh girl on her gap year, they decided to settle in the Carpathian Valley, where you can find them and half my viewer base today. While they lived in the Carpathian Valley, Hungarians converted to Christianity and integrated their culture with Western Europe. The kingdom lasted up until the 16th century, when the Ottoman Empire conquered them. Then came the Austrian Habsburg dynasty, who, throughout the centuries, they eventually took up a junior partnership with, called the dual monarchy. This set a precedent where the kings of Austria became the kings of Hungary, and Hungary was its own dependent nation. Now you say, hey Tom, what does this have to do with civil society? Well, dear viewer, it is this dual monarchy that is so important to this video. The philosopher Vada said, Hungary has a bourgeois mentality, but no citizen mentality. Let's break this down. We can describe the bourgeois mentality as liberalism, which was the philosophy that can be loosely defined as wanting liberty, consent of the governed, and equality before the law. Likewise, we can define the citizen mentality as nationalism, which we'll say is a movement that advocates that each nation or group of people should govern itself. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, nationalism and liberalism were as linked as Boris Johnson and bad haircuts. Many advocates of liberalism were also advocates of nationalism, but not as much in Hungary, since Hungarians were okay with being a junior partner to Austria. This turned out rather well for Hungarian civil society. Because they were conquered but not necessarily oppressed, like their neighbors in Poland and Czechoslovakia, Hungarians didn't have a violent urge to set up a free and independent nation state. Besides 1956. Patriotism in Hungary was based on a certain lifestyle, culture, and attitude, rather than battles and former tales of glory. This is in contrast to today's Hungary, where Fidesz controls the parliament, and some right-wingers can't get over the First World War. But during the days of the People's Republic, Hungarian identity was mainly about drinking palinka, going to cafes, and whatever else is considered European culture. In general, Hungarians were already okay with another junior partnership. Now, not everything was all sunshine and rainbows in the People's Republic, nor would I begin to suggest that today's Hungary is worse off. After all, this was a communist dictatorship, and Hungary did face similar social ills that plagued its neighbors. The Communist Party fully took control of Hungarian politics in 1949 under a man named Matthias Rákosi, and if history can tell us anything, things only got worse from there. So worse in fact that Hungarians decided to revolt against the government in 1956. This started what we call the Hungarian Revolution, which was eventually ended by the Soviet Union and allied communist Hungarians. After the revolution in 1956, Hungarians generally did not believe that the state was something they needed to rebel against. Much of this has to do with a man named Kadar, who essentially controlled Hungary from 1956 to the end of communism in Hungary. He was a leader of the reformist faction within the Communist Party and later founded the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party that controlled Hungary until the fall of the People's Republic in 1989. It was partly because of Kadar that the transition in Hungary from dictatorship to democracy was gradual and non-violent. Kadar instituted multiple reforms that relaxed communist policy in Hungary. His reforms were branded as goulash communism, after the traditional Hungarian dish, as opposed to ghoulish communism, which is just communism and its naturally occurring state. Goulash communism led Hungary to be known as the Happy Little Hut in the Warsaw Pact. The standard of living in Hungary was considerably higher than its Eastern Bloc neighbors, and it didn't receive nearly as oppressive rule as East Germany and Poland. Under Kadar, the Hungarian state acted in its duty to its citizens. The Hungarian People's Republic was very much afraid of another revolution, so Kadar's government decided to give Hungarians some things that parted with communist doctrine in order to satisfy them. The Hungarian government behaved as a liaison between its citizens and the Soviet hegemon, and thus acted as an enlightened despot. Which I like to throw in there, because it's another one of your AP words that in reality don't mean anything. Now get ready for some quick maths. Quick maths! Because I'm going to throw some numbers at you. In 1985, 88% of Hungarians declared confidence in their nation's leaders, although only 10 to 16% of Hungarians believed that they could cause any kind of change within the government. The idea of "without us, before us" became the epitaph of Kadar's paternalistic regime. In other words, although Hungarians believed the government made decisions without them, Hungarians themselves tended to be okay with the decisions that were being made. Kadar's reform success made the state adhere to its communist principles and the loving rules of the Soviet Empire, while it also silenced calls for reform. In particular, the opportunity to work after hours gave laborers the ability to make that cash money, as well as compete in a freer labor market. However, this idea of "without us, before us" shouldn't be mistaken as something good in the long run. Because Hungarians believed that they couldn't cause change within the government, they became apathetic, and without any kind of democratic oversight that may have halted them, the government relied on short-sighted policies that has led Hungary into the many problems that it has today. The high standard of living and refusal to downsize during economic recessions resulted in high budget deficits, as the Kadar government borrowed from the West. Hungary's debt in 1985 was worth around $12 billion, while the GDP of the entire country was only around 22.5. This careless spending has led to the high levels of debt that Hungary still has today. During the 80s, many economists in Hungary realized the debt problem and called for economic reform. Economists weren't the only advocates of change either. Although there was no institutionalized opposition, there were many reformists, including populists, Catholic clergy, and Democrats, watching from the shadows. One of these reformists was a young, charismatic student named Viktor Orbán, the leader of Fidesz and current Prime Minister of Hungary. He rose to prominence partly because of the long-term failings of the Kadar regime, but also because of the successes. Despite long-term failings, Kadar's regime did allow a certain type of civil society. It wasn't based on Aristotle's concept of dialogue, but it did act in a popular way. Kadar was still a ruthless dictator, but a strategic one. And this strategic approach of giving in to public demands made sure there was no real structural opposition. Insert whatever type of commentary you have about Ed Miliband and Bernie Sanders here. What we can gather from these points is that Hungarian society was both structured because of its history and willing to reform because of Kadar. Now this is all well and good, but why does this matter? Well, you can think of Hungary's social system as a labor union that bargained on the behalf of its citizens with the Soviets. Kadar's regime even negotiated between Czechoslovakian and Soviet governments during the Prague Spring. Splitting the difference and walking the tightrope is what Kadar did best. He was a reformist, but most importantly, he was at the top of the hierarchy. Kadar and his cronies, the people who actually reformed Hungary, were in a position of power. They might not have had ultimate authority over the land, but they did have incredible sway over Hungarian policy in Moscow and absolute power in Budapest. In modern history, this has been the way the vast majority of things have been changed. Slowly, cautiously, and from the top. For Hungary, working within the system led to a much more peaceful and stable evolution of cultural change. Just an FYI and a PSA, I substituted the Russian Federation flag for the Soviet flag in a lot of instances in this video, because apparently the corporate overlords at YouTube can't tell the difference between someone with journalistic integrity and a hate group. Yes, these are things that are literally happening. I cannot make this up. In order to fight for free speech against the corporate mechanism that envelops us all, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell for my channel. And most importantly, don't forget to tune in next week as we go over civil society in communist Poland.